The buttons hit the diner floor one by one. Nobody breathed. Lena stood there clutching what was left of her uniform, while three men laughed like hyenas in a cage they thought they owned. Then, the bell above the door chimed. Mateo stepped in. Calm, silent, controlled, and somehow that was worse. No shouting, no threats, just one look at his wife, and the temperature in the entire diner dropped. In that moment, the men who thought they were predators realized they were already trapped inside someone else's ending.
Feels. Step inside this fading roadside diner with me today and watch a modern tragedy unfold beneath the flickering neon lights. The air was suffocatingly heavy, choked with the hollow laughter of three thugs who had just torn a waitress's uniform. Feels. They wore their toxic masculinity like cheap cologne, utterly blind to the reality of the room. They had no idea her husband was Mateo Marquez, a ghost of the criminal underworld whispered of as the Black Lion, a man forged in pure violence. Feels. When the front door chime echoed, their unearned dominance simply bled out onto the greasy floor. True power never needs to announce itself. It just occupies the space. Feels. You and I must learn this essential life lesson. The loudest voice in the room is almost always the weakest. Feels. The sudden crack of a shattered coffee pot against the faded tiles rang out like a starting pistol, plunging the diner into terror. Lena Marquez stood frozen near booth 7, clutching the torn edges of her dress. Feels. The ugly laughter of the men bounced off the stained walls, a pathetic display of pack mentality. The patrons turned into statues of fear, their forks hanging in midair. Yet beneath Lena's stillness lay a profound failsafe. Feels. A dark knowing that none of these terrified onlookers could grasp. Within 10 fleeting minutes, these arrogant men would face complete ruin. The lesson here is profound. Every cruel action we take carries a consequence we can never outrun. Feels. This nightmare began just as the autumn sun died over the highway, bleeding orange across the cold asphalt. Feels. At 31 years of age, Lena carried a carefully sculpted aura of profound peace. Her uniform acted as a gentle shield, designed to disarm the weary souls walking through those doors. Feels. The regulars felt their heavy burdens lift simply by meeting her calm gaze. To a passing glance, she was just a kind woman with a warm smile. But the harsh truth is that the deepest compassion is usually born from the deepest unspeakable pain. Feels. Her hazel eyes guarded a brutal history of survival alongside a monster. As she wiped down the counter, breathing in slow rhythms to anchor her spirit, the sudden chime of the front door shattered her sanctuary forever. Feels. We must remember this vital truth. Peace built on top of buried trauma is only ever a temporary illusion waiting to be broken. Feels. You and I must look closely at the men who brought this doom upon themselves. They kicked the diner door wide open, their voices booming loudly to mask their own insignificance. Feels. The leader swept his eyes over the booths as if he owned the very air people breathed. His two shadows barked ugly jokes, desperately marking their territory. He snapped his fingers, barking orders at Lena with casual cruelty. Feels. But Lena did not break under the pressure. She gathered the menus, her face a mask of absolute neutrality, answering them with quiet grace. She understood a powerful lesson. Reacting to a cruel fool only hands him the power he craves. Feels. Her unshakable calm twisted the knife in their fragile egos, causing the heavy shadow at the leader's elbow to let out a dark, mocking sneer. Feels. Refusing to simply sit quietly, the three men claimed the center booth, an aggressive move designed to cast their dark shadow over the room. The air grew immediately thick. The regulars shrank into themselves, staring silently at their cold plates. Feels. Back in the kitchen, old Jimmy wiped his sweaty palms on his apron, his terrified eyes darting toward the window. When Lena approached for their order, the leader threw a calculated insult, desperate to see her crack. Feels. They turned the quiet diner into a miserable theater of cruelty, treating Lena like a worthless pawn. This teaches us a timeless lesson. Cruelty toward the vulnerable is always a loud confession of inner weakness. They pushed endlessly, Feels, entirely blind to the violent tragedy they were writing for themselves. Feels. This is where the tension becomes truly unbearable. Through every vile insult, Lena held on to a devastatingly calm baseline. She absorbed their chaos without a flinch, standing like a wall built from years of surviving the unspeakable. Feels. One lackey laughed, asking if she was too stupid to understand their threats. The leader, furious that his toxic masculinity could not break her, finally reached out. His thick fingers clamped violently around her wrist. Feels. He demanded she bow her head to him. The lesson here is that true strength lies in holding your ground when the world turns hostile. Lena softly asked him to let go. Instead of listening, he crossed the ultimate point of no return, heels, violently yanking her pale blue uniform until the fabric tore completely apart. Heels. The sickening sound of ripping cotton hung heavy in the stagnant diner air. Observe how the room shatters while she remains completely whole. The elderly woman in booth 3 gasped for breath. The transport driver shifted his weight, heels, preparing to throw his life away for a stranger, while old Jimmy dropped his spatula onto the greasy floor. Yet Lena did not panic. Her chest rose and fell in a perfect steady rhythm. The leader smiled a crooked smile, heels, his eyes shining with the sick thrill of a man who loves to destroy. Everyone else was frozen, but Lena never cried out. We must learn that fear only masters those who have nothing left to believe in. She remained tethered to a dark truth, heels, understanding the lethal equation these foolish men had completely failed to calculate, heels. Then the small brass bell above the heavy door chimed softly. Mateo Marquez stepped into the harsh fluorescent light, bringing a cold, suffocating dread inside with him, heels. He wore simple clothes that perfectly hid the lethal tension coiled in his shoulders. His dark eyes swept the room like a camera lens, instantly registering the torn fabric and the quiet trembling of his wife, heels. The transport driver recognized the terrifying walk of a man who ends lives. He laid his hands flat on the table, begging for silent mercy. Old Jimmy simply vanished into the kitchen shadows, but the three men noticed absolutely nothing, heels. They did not see the angel of death pull out a stool. The lesson is clear. Arrogant pride is a heavy blindfold that keeps us from seeing our own violent end approaching, heels. Mateo sat in terrifying stillness, his dark gaze pinned to the men in the center booth. When he spoke, his voice was a whisper, yet it cut through the thick air like a rusted blade. He simply said, "Lena, come here, heels. If you and I want to understand the dark poetry of power, we must pay attention to this moment." Lena walked toward him, ignoring the cold air against her torn shoulder. The diner held its collective breath, trapped in an agonizing pocket of time, heels. The gravity of the room had violently shifted to the quiet man at the counter. The leader's cruel smile finally died as the crushing weight of his mistake settled over him, heels. This scene teaches us a brutal truth. We almost always recognize our absolute ruin a single second too late to do anything about it, heels. The self-proclaimed alpha male, trying to glue his shattered pride back together, puffed out his chest and barked a question at Mateo. It is a profound tragedy to watch a dead man try to speak. Mateo erased his existence with complete agonizing silence, heels. He did not even blink in the leader's direction. Instead, he gently traced the lines of Lena's face, watching the tiny tremors in her fingers. His voice was a velvet shadow when he asked if she was hurt. "No," she whispered softly. But as their eyes met, heels, the tragic truth hung heavy in the room. They both knew his question had nothing to do with her physical pain. It was a violent countdown. The lesson here is terrifying. True love sometimes wears the face of unimaginable wrath, heels, and the blood that is about to spill can never be washed away, heels. To truly feel the heavy weight of the violence about to explode, we must look back into the dark shadows of Mateo's past. Years ago, he was the undisputed king of the Marquez crime family. He ruled not by blind fear, but through terrifying, heels, blood-bound loyalty. He was a ruthless monster wrapped in a code of honor. Lena, cursed with a bleeding heart, saw through the bloodstains to the broken boy beneath. She thought she could save him, heels. The lesson is painful. We often doom our own souls by trying to heal the unhealable. She fell deeply in love, closing her eyes to the graves he had dug, blinded by her desperate need to fix his brokenness, heels. She convinced herself his tender hands could not belong to a butcher, permanently tying her gentle soul to a man who authored human tragedies, heels. You and I both know that violent secrets like theirs cannot stay buried forever. Their quiet life together was a fragile house of glass, balancing her pure heart against his bloody hands, heels. That glass shattered on a freezing night during a supposed peace talk. 15 armed rivals cornered him and his loyal brothers. The sky tore open in a deafening storm of fire and lead. When the ashes cooled, heels, they found nothing of Mateo but whispers and ghost stories. For 8 long months, the underworld believed the Black Lion was dead. Lena fell into an endless, suffocating blackness. She vanished from the world, heels, mourning a love that had almost destroyed her. This teaches us a hard truth. Sometimes surviving the loss of the one you love is the cruelest punishment of all. But the dead man had returned, heels. Let the camera pan across the dimly lit, terrifyingly quiet diner. Monsters never truly vanish, they merely sleep in the shadows. Mateo had arrived at her door years ago, his flesh ruined by fire and bullets, a ghost returning to his only anchor, heels. Their connection was an unbreakable trauma bond forged in mutual destruction. He offered a grim confession. He could not survive without her gravity keeping him sane. So they shed their old skins, attempting to build a quiet life. Heels. Lena used this diner to cultivate a safe haven, pouring coffee instead of cleaning up blood. But human nature is an irreversible tragedy. We must remember this simple truth. You can change your name and hide in the furthest town, heels, but no amount of quiet will ever permanently bury the dormant instincts of a true predator, heels. Let us step inside this quiet diner, a fragile sanctuary that held back the dark for 3 years. But you and I know the illusion of peace always expires. Mateo rises from his stool, his slow motion instantly freezing the air. Heels. He walks toward the booth with the terrifying certainty of a predator. The aggressor senses the shift, scrambling to salvage his ego. He stammers a weak excuse about just having fun with the waitress, heels, while his friends suffocate under a primal urge to flee. Mateo stops at their table. The harsh lights catch the absolute void in his eyes. Without raising his voice, he delivers a simple command. Stand up. The leader sits entirely frozen, heels. It reminds us of a vital truth. Arrogance is always the first casualty when you finally face an irreversible threat. Heels. What? I said, stand up. Mateo keeps his face an unreadable canvas, showing the restraint of a man who has authored countless tragedies. This terrifying lack of emotion makes the leader's hand shake violently against the table. He stands, trembling, heels, fighting to hold eye contact while pleading that they want no trouble. Mateo responds with a voice like cracking ice. Then you should not have touched her. From the shadows, a weathered trucker steps forward, his face drained of blood, heels, and whispers a truth into the bully's ear. Instantly, the man's entire reality shatters. Oh God, he gasps. You are the Black Lion. The profound lesson here is inescapable. Heels. Your darkest reputation is a relentless shadow that will always outrun your desperate attempts to hide from the past. Heels. The stocky man recoils, knocking a glass to the floor with a sharp crash. His friend is already backing toward the exit. Mateo offers a slow, hollow smile that never reaches his eyes. Now you are starting to understand. Heels. The leader's hands shake as his fake bravado melts into suffocating panic. We did not know, he stammers. We would not have. Sato steps closer. Trapped. You would not have what? Hurt her? Humiliated her? Torn her clothes? Heels. His whisper paralyzes the room. You hunted her because you thought she was alone, and you believed you were safe. Mateo lets his gaze drift back to Lena, who quietly watches her abusers break. It teaches us a vital truth about human nature. Heels. Cowards only bare their teeth when they firmly believe no one is watching in the dark. Heels. You were wrong on all counts. The thug's throat tightens, choking on his fear. Look, Mr. Marquez, we did not know who she was. If we had known. Mateo cuts him off with a softness that cuts deeper than a blade. If you had known, heels, you simply would have ruined someone else. Someone without a monster standing in their corner. He tilts his head, studying the man like a psychologist dissecting a broken mind. That is what you are confessing, is it not? The bully freezes, heels, entirely stripped of defense. Mateo slowly lowers himself into the booth. Sit. The men exchange terrified glances. Knowing that running guarantees their end, the leader sinks into the vinyl cushions. We learn a grim reality here, heels. A bully's bravado vanishes the exact second they realize the prey has sharper teeth, heels. The diner becomes so quiet you can hear the neon sign buzzing. Let us analyze this moment together, you and I. Mateo leans back, using his relaxed posture as a deliberate psychological weapon. Tell me, when you walked in tonight, what did you see? Heels. The leader swallows heavily. I do not understand. Mateo leans closer. A simple question. What did you see when you looked at her? The man stares at his trembling hands. I saw a waitress. What else? Mateo's voice is a velvet trap. Come on, heels. You saw a vulnerability. What validated your sick impulse? The younger thug cracks under the pressure. We thought she looked soft. Soft, Mateo repeats, weighing the word like a stone. You mean weak. The lesson here is profoundly tragic, heels. The cruelest among us will always mistake a woman's quiet grace for easy prey, heels. The thug hangs his head, offering no denial. Mateo taps his finger against the table. The sound makes all 3 men flinch as if struck by a whip. Let me tell you what I see when I look at her. I see a woman who survived the end of the world, heels. Someone whose heart was so shattered her body forgot how to live. Yet she built herself back from the ashes. His voice is a low rumble, heavy with the tragic weight of their history. I see a soul carrying infinitely more strength than any of you cowards feels. The old trucker watches this unfold with grim approval. The leader pleads frantically. We are really sorry. We will pay for her uniform. We will pay for everything. It reveals a harsh reality feels. Apologies born from absolute terror are never meant to seek forgiveness. They exist solely to secure survival feels. You think this is about money? A sharp edge cuts through Mateo's tone, exposing the beast hiding beneath his skin. You humiliated her in her only sanctuary. You think cash erases that scarring. The stocky man begins to openly weep, feels, his voice shattering under the weight of submission. Then what do you want? We will do whatever you want, please. Mateo lets a suffocating silence stretch out, savoring their dread. He turns his head toward Lena. She stands under the flickering lights, feels, arms wrapped tightly across her chest. What do you want, Lena? Every eye shifts to her. Her face is an unreadable portrait of tragedy as she looks down at the broken men. We uncover a valuable lesson here, feels. The abuser is always the most fragile creature in the room once their illusion of control is shattered, feels. When a soul is tethered to a creature of violence, it craves justice of the mind, not the flesh. Lena does not want these men buried in the desert. She does not want the black lion to shed their blood, feels. She simply wants them to feel the agonizing weight of their own cruelty. Her gaze is a terrifying hollow calm, forcing them to choke on the trauma they caused. Mateo watches her, reading the unspoken script of their tragic romance, feels, and honors her silent plea. He leans in, dismantling the last of their pride with the precision of a surgeon. Then, without a single word, he simply snaps his fingers. It brings us to a chilling realization about dominance, feels. We learn that true power is never found in a desperate scream. It is the agonizingly quiet breath taken right before the fatal strike, feels. That snap echoes through the diner like a gunshot. Stick with me, because this is where the unseen world reveals itself. From the darkest booth, two figures step into the neon light. One is an older man with lethal elegance, feels. The other an enforcer built like a cinder block. They move with a haunting, wordless grace, showing the synchronization of wolves closing in. The bullies realize their fatal mistake instantly. The color drains from their faces as panic takes over, feels. Mateo's voice remains detached, devoid of warmth. He promises no blood will be spilled indoors. They are merely going outside for a final conversation. It forces us to confront a timeless truth, feels. Our own arrogance is exactly what blinds us to the monsters sitting patiently in the shadows, feels. It is a universal psychological rule. The loudest aggressors always shatter the fastest when they become the prey. The stocky man breaks down sobbing, begging for mercy, crying out that he has a family. Mateo stares at him with cold disgust, feels. He points out the bitter irony. This man gave no thought to family when he cornered another man's wife. As the extraction begins, the youngest thug surrenders to panic. He blindly tries to sprint for the door, but pure fear makes you clumsy, feels. The silver-haired enforcer casually blocks his path, while the muscle seizes his arm with the bone-crushing grip of an undertaker. They drag him toward the exit. We must remember this painful life lesson, feels. Trying to outrun your consequences only guarantees a much deeper wound when fate finally catches up, feels. In a final act of desperation, the leader turns to Lena, begging her to call off the wolves. But grief burned away her naive mercy long ago. Her eyes are like empty glass when she whispers that she is not the one he needs to pray to. Beyond the window, feels. Two black sedans idle in the dark like mechanical beasts waiting to carry these men into the abyss. Mateo sits back down at the counter. He slowly extends his scarred hand. With a trembling breath, feels. She intertwines her fingers with his, a tragic surrender to the exact man who brought the violence she tried so hard to escape. He whispers a quiet apology for waking up their old ghosts. The ultimate life lesson of this tragedy is inescapable, feels. You can drive hundreds of miles away, but your darkest shadow will always ride right beside you, feels. Let us step back as the camera pans across the shattered diner. Maria, barely out of her teens, steps from the flickering glare of the kitchen. Her hands shake as she wraps a borrowed sweater around Lena's shoulders, whispering a breathless thank you, feels. Lena held her ground when anyone else would have crumbled. It is a fascinating psychological phenomenon, how victims find immense strength in the survival of another. In the shadows, Mateo remains perfectly still, feels. A cold statue carved from a lifetime of violence, he forces the heavy air into his lungs, bringing his racing heart down to a methodical rhythm. Old Jimmy silently slides a mug of black coffee across the wood. He does not say a single word. Feels. You learn quickly in this world that the quietest acts of grace are the only true medicine after surviving sheer terror. Feels. Human instinct always craves a hierarchy when the room is still shaking from chaos. Notice how Jimmy's trembling hands retreat, submitting to the new apex predator. But Mateo is playing a much deeper, far more tragic game here. Feels. He turns slowly on his vinyl stool, dipping his head to offer a surprisingly gentle apology for the ruined evening. It is a flawless psychological shift. In the blink of an eye, Feels, he strips off the mask of the monster and cloaks himself as their reluctant shield. An elderly woman spits curses at the departed thugs. Even the towering trucker steps out from the shadows, Feels, desperate to align his fragile ego with the man who just commanded the room. It reveals a deeply uncomfortable truth about our nature. We will gladly forgive the absolute worst kind of monster, Feels, so long as that monster is the one standing guard at our own front door. Feels. Let us pause and look at this exact frame together, you and I, because it captures how society drags dangerous men back into the light. The trucker bows his head, romanticizing the bloody days when Mateo kept the real vultures at bay 15 years ago. Feels. He paints a tragic picture of a decaying city, begging for the shadow of the Black Lion to return. Mateo stares hard at the floor, swearing that old version of himself is buried. But the trucker twists the knife, Feels, insisting a true king never abandons his territory. Mateo's scarred hand stops dead on his coffee mug. You can see his jaw clench under the harsh neon, weighing the heavy cost of his next breath. Life always demands a toll, Feels, teaching us one agonizing rule. The exact second a retired warrior picks up his old sword to defend his home, his hard-earned peace is gone forever. Feels. Stick with me here, because we are about to watch a masterclass in psychological warfare. The diner sinks into a breathless, heavy silence, so absolute that even the buzzing neon sign seems to fade out. Mateo stands up tall, Feels, bathed in that sickly yellow light, speaking of dignity and inescapable consequence. He promises the room that those thugs will not suffer a single broken bone. Instead, they will face a terrifyingly cold empathy protocol, Feels. From the safety of the kitchen shadows, Maria whispers, asking what could possibly be worse than a brutal beating. Mateo's eyes go entirely dead, Feels. He plans to force them to look directly into the weeping eyes of the innocent families they have shattered. A bruised body heals, but true punishment is never physical. The ultimate inescapable cage is the crushing, Feels, suffocating weight of a suddenly awakened conscience, Feels. The silence stretches tight until Lena finally speaks, her voice thin and shaking. She is terrified the sleeping ghost of his past is waking up right in front of her. She asks if he is tearing up their sacred contract for a quiet life. At her words, Feels. Mateo turns, and the cold stone of his posture shatters completely. Underneath that hardened shell is a man drowning in a desperate need to keep her safe. He wraps his scarred hand around her trembling fingers, physically grounding her, Feels. He whispers that this is not about reclaiming his bloody crown, but about breaking the cycle of violence forever. They have to see the poison they inject into the veins of the city. As he looks out at the exhausted faces, Feels, a heavy truth settles over the room. Broken men do not stop hurting others just because society locks them up. Real change requires an honest mirror, never a simple lecture. Feels. The power dynamic in the room shifts into a completely new shape. An older man leans forward, asking what happens after these thugs are forced to look at their own rotting souls. Mateo's voice remains steady, like calm water over sharp rocks. Feels. He speaks of offering them a narrow path to channel their violent urges into protecting the weak. Some might find redemption, but he knows most will fail. The trucker nods, finally understanding the vast gulf between blind vengeance and true justice. Feels. Jimmy then steps out from the greasy smoke of the kitchen. His eyes are glued to the floor, his face burning with the suffocating shame of his cowardice. He confesses he simply froze while innocent people suffered. Feels. We have to forgive our fragile humanity in these dark moments. Courage is never the magical absence of terror. It is the agonizing, conscious choice to step forward despite it. Feels. Jimmy wipes his brow, the crushing weight of his regret washing over him. He whispers that he should have fought back the exact second their laughter turned cruel. Lena tries to soften his bleeding conscience, Feels, reminding him that ordinary people are simply not built for war. But the elderly woman shakes her head, her spine stiffening in defiance. She rejects the comfort, declaring their collective silence a cowardly sin. Watch carefully what Mateo does next, Feels. He steps right into their shared shame, offering a harsh but necessary salvation. He demands that the next time a wolf circles, they must shatter the illusion. Scream, throw a glass, break the quiet, heals. Predators feed entirely on the frozen lungs of their victims. Abuse only ever grows in the dark, unchallenged soil of silence. Choosing to use your own voice is the absolute simplest, most effective cure for our shared fear. Heals. The trucker shifts his heavy boots, fighting his way out of that suffocating helplessness. He reveals a crumpled napkin where he wrote down the thug's license plates right before the rescue began. Mateo offers him a slow, respectful nod, heals, validating the man's quiet act of defiance. He reminds the room that bearing witness is a profound act of resistance. Suddenly, a massive wave of exhaustion washes over Mateo, his broad shoulders folding under the immense gravity of his old life. Heals. Lena steps smoothly into his shadow, resting her head against his chest. He holds her softly, no longer a savage beast guarding a fresh kill. Outside, the cold night swallows the desolate highway. But inside, the entire atmosphere has shifted. Heals. When we finally manage to link our fragile hands in the dark, our shared human vulnerability transforms into an unbreakable shield. Heals. The suffocating tension drains as everyone drags themselves back to reality. The trucker sits down, and the couple follows, sending a fragile ripple of normalcy across the room. Silverware finally clinks against cheap porcelain, but make no mistake, heals. Their souls are permanently rewired. Mateo lifts his heavy mug, closing his eyes as the bitter coffee anchors his racing nervous system. Lena stays woven into his side, absorbing his quiet strength to calm the residual tremor in her bones. Heals. The diner mimics a peaceful midnight stop, yet invisible scars pulse right beneath the surface. Jimmy shuffles over with a fresh pot, but Mateo raises a calm hand to decline. 20 full minutes have bled away in total silence. Heals. Profound healing never starts with a victorious roar. It is always born in the agonizingly quiet, steady breaths right after the terrible storm breaks. Heals. Mateo finally breaks the heavy quiet, placing a gentle hand beneath Lena's elbow to pull her to her feet. He whispers that it is time to finish the grim work. Lena's fingers instantly dig into his forearm, desperate to reclaim control. Heals. She demands he stop right now. Mateo turns, and the rest of the room fades until there is only the massive gravity between them. She stares into his eyes, demanding the boundaries of his vengeance, reminding him of the sacred promise of peace. Heals. Mateo argues that the universe demands a heavy payment for her terror. But Lena stands taller. They humiliated her, she whispers, but they did not touch her soul. We must always remember this ultimate truth. Heals. Enduring a painful event does not mean you are permanently broken. It simply reveals the magnificent, diamond-hard structural integrity of your own spirit. Heals. Lena presses her palm against his chest, feeling the violent drumming of his heart. Mateo's jaw clenches, betraying the dark hurricane spinning inside his mind. He asks quietly if she expects him to simply let the wolves back out to hunt. Heals. Lena does not flinch. She reclaims her fire, ordering him to execute his twisted empathy protocol, but adding one terrifyingly brave twist. She must actively participate. Mateo's face twitches in agonizing dissonance. To understand this moment, Heals, we have to look at Lena's past. She spent years walking shattered youth through the dark, believing fiercely that ruined souls can be rebuilt. She knows the deepest secret of human survival. Heals. You can never just be handed your salvation on a silver platter. True, lasting recovery requires you to step boldly back into the fire and take an active, fearless role in saving yourself. Heals. The dormant social worker inside Lena tears its way to the surface. She outlines a bold path of exposure therapy, declaring she will look her monsters in the eye. Mateo instantly forbids it, desperate to keep her safely hidden. Heals. Lena's grip tightens into a vice. She is fighting for the survival of her soul. She knows if she lets him act as her shield, the terror will turn to stone inside her chest, and her voice will vanish forever. She points a shaking finger toward the booths. Heals. Everyone in this diner, even Mateo, cast her as the fragile victim needing rescue. She refuses to stay locked in that cage. This is the tragic flaw of our deep affection. We throw ourselves in front of bullets for the ones we cherish. Heals. Never realizing that rescuing a person can accidentally rob them of the exact strength they need to truly heal themselves. Heals. Picture the camera pushing in slowly on Lena, the diner bathed in the sickly yellow glow of overhead lights. She carefully dissects the heavy power dynamics hanging in the stale air. The second Mateo breached the doorway, he seized executive control. Heals. Radiating pure violence. While her chest aches with gratitude for his fierce protection, she sees the fatal psychological flaw in his method. If he destroys these men while she remains a mute spectator, the tragic loop of her trauma will never close. Feels. The patrons fall into a breathless hush. Jimmy, wiping the counter with the slow rhythm of a man who has seen too many broken souls, speaks up. His voice is a gravelly balm. Feels. He quietly notes that rushing to save someone often strips them of their agency. True healing only blossoms when we step back and let the wounded trace their own agonizing path toward justice. Feels. Let us look closely at how this scene frames power. The elderly woman rises, the harsh clack of her cane striking the floor like a warning shot. She completely dominates the diner. Staring into Mateo's eyes, Feels. She becomes a living witness to Lena's endurance. For 2 grueling years, she has watched Lena diffuse violent men with unshakable grace. Tapping the wood again, Feels. She challenges Mateo to swallow his toxic savior complex and let Lena fight her own psychological war. You and I can see the torment twisting Mateo's face. His primal urge to shield his violently collides with his respect for her agency. Feels. It beautifully illustrates a hard truth. Sometimes true love means standing totally still and trusting the profound strength of the person you hold dear. Feels. A ragged breath tears from Mateo's chest, marking a physical surrender of his need for control. His voice drops to a heavy rumble, asking for her strategy. Lena admits there is no master plan. Feels. Just the terrifying psychological need to face her abusers and shatter their twisted illusion that a soft voice equals weak prey. The camera lingers on Mato as he absorbs her raw courage. Calling Marco, his command is final. Feels. Stop the violent retaliation and bring the men inside. He hands the stage entirely to his wife. A 5-minute countdown starts. Lena's pulse hammers against her ribs, panic rising in her throat, yet she manages a firm nod. Feels. Life teaches us that the only way to truly conquer a lingering nightmare is to stare directly into its hollow eyes and absolutely refuse to look away. Feels. Notice how the lighting softens when Mateo reaches out. His fingers cradle her face, acting as an emotional anchor. He whispers one last condition. If those men make a single threat, his violent persona returns. Feels. Lena grabs his wrists with shocking strength. She demands his unwavering faith, redefining the boundaries of their marriage. Mateo closes his eyes, almost breaking under the vulnerability of letting her face the wolves alone. When he opens them, Feels. The mafia boss is gone, replaced by a man looking at his wife with pure reverence. Outside, harsh headlights slash through the dark street. The abusers are here. Lena straightens her spine, swallowing her terror. We learn a profound truth here, Feels. Finding true inner peace often requires us to willingly walk back into the very flames that once burned us. Feels. The heavy door swings open, dragging the night air inside. The 3 abusers are shoved into the stark fluorescent light, forced to confront the quiet woman they previously victimized. The camera pans across their defeated body language. Feels. The ringleader is stripped of his toxic armor, looking completely hollow. His friend shakes uncontrollably, trapped in the aftermath of pure panic. The youngest boy keeps his eyes glued to the scuffed floor, drowning in deep shame. Marco, Feels, the quiet enforcer of the crime family, gives Mateo a subtle nod. Before slipping back into the shadows, Marco shoots Lena a look of profound, silent respect. Feels. This scene proves that there is nothing more powerful than a shattered person picking up their broken pieces to forge their own unyielding reality. Feels. You and I must pause here to appreciate this massive shift in psychological energy. When the detective asked Lena if she was sure about dropping the charges, she gave him a look colder than ice. As the police fade away, Feels. This diner transforms into a stark arena. Lena steps into the center frame, clutching a soft cardigan over her torn blouse, creating a fragile visual shield over her trauma. The former predators are now the prey, pressed hard against the glass door. Feels. The late-night patrons become a silent jury, watching a masterpiece of psychological dismantling. The alpha male, his ego fracturing under immense humiliation, tries to save face by stammering out a weak apology. Feels. Lena cuts him down with one single syllable. Her voice is soft, yet it carries an absolute authority that instantly destroys his pathetic defense. Feels. The diner's silence is heavy. Elizna tells the leader he has not earned the right to speak. The camera captures every micro-expression of their dread. The stocky guy shifts nervously under the harsh lights. Feels. While the thinnest boy wraps his arms around his ribs, trying to shrink into nothingness. Lena takes a deliberate step forward. In the background, Mateo stands rigid as stone. Feels. fighting a brutal internal war against his violent instincts just to let her hold the room. She locks eyes with the leader, asking if they comprehend what public degradation does to a human soul. He freezes, slowly shaking his head. Heals. Lena tears apart their toxic worldview, exposing them as hollow parasites desperate for unearned power. She then delivers the ultimate psychological blow, whispering that their violence completely failed to break her. Heals. This shows us that a damaged surface never equals a destroyed foundation. Heals. Notice how she never raises her voice. Her words act as a precise surgical cut, mapping out the exact anatomy of her emotional trauma. They didn't just ruin her clothes, they detonated a fragile piece it took her 3 agonizing years to construct. Heals. You and I can feel the collective heartbreak rippling through the room. An older man wipes a tear, while the grill cook grips the counter until his knuckles turn white. Pointing to the worn booths, Heals. Lena describes this humble space as her ultimate sanctuary. She forces them to understand they didn't just attack a woman, they poisoned a safe harbor built for broken people. The cook offers a solemn nod. Then comes the true narrative climax. Heals. Rather than demanding a violent underworld execution, she calmly hands them a choice. It is a brilliant psychological reversal. They stole her control, so she weaponizes the terrifying burden of absolute free will right back against them. Heals. A twisted spark of hope registers on the gang leader's face. His chest puffs out slightly as he grasps at the illusion of an easy exit. The camera pushes in close on Lena just as she drops the hammer. Heals. She gestures to the heavy shadows where Mateo stands, allowing the crushing weight of his crime syndicate to speak for itself. In a deadpan tone, she paints a masterpiece of modern ruin. If they walk out that door, Heals, his network will systematically erase their existence, promising a lifetime of paranoid hypervigilance and destroyed futures. The boys freeze in synchronized terror. You and I must admire the sheer architectural genius of her trap. Heals. She entirely shatters their psychological defenses before offering a tiny sliver of light. It isn't some cheap free pass. She forces them onto the hardest path conceivable, a brutal, inescapable crucible designed to force a painful, Heals, genuine redemption. Heals. The terms of her punishment hang over the room like a heavy judicial sentence. She sentences them to a devastating psychological immersion into raw human grief. Instead of a jail cell, Heals, they are forced into the homes of families mourning victims destroyed by toxic men exactly like them. They must serve and quietly absorb the endless devastation they represent. The youngest boy, his voice violently cracking, Heals, asks how long this living nightmare will endure. Lena does not even blink. Her voice carries absolute authority. It lasts until their warped minds are entirely rewritten. She locks onto the leader, watching his eyes dart away in guilty panic. Heals, confirming he is a serial predator. This fire will not stop until their violent impulses turn to ash. If their souls are beyond repair, they rot in this emotional purgatory permanently. Stripped of his fake bravado, Heals, the leader weakly stammers out one final question. What happens if they refuse? Heals. From the pitch-black shadows, Mateo's voice breaks the silence, dropping like a heavy tombstone. He states that if they refuse, his syndicate will wipe them from the earth. The terror of that reality breaks the stocky kid. Heals. He collapses onto the floor tiles, sobbing and begging for forgiveness. The camera frames Lena looking down, her expression devoid of pity. She rejects his performative tears, Heals, demanding he carve that promise into his own broken conscience rather than dumping it at her feet. The blocking of the scene then shifts beautifully. The elderly woman begins a deliberate, slow march across the room. Heals. The sharp scrape of her cane slices through the boy's pathetic sobs. Stopping inches from the gang leader, she leans on her aide. Heals. 80 years of witnessing the darkest corners of toxic cruelty are concentrated into one terrifying glare that completely atomizes his fragile ego. Heals. The old woman's voice crackles with a crushing sorrow. She speaks of her own grandchild, destroyed by predatory men exactly like them. She wields this grief like a scalpel, cutting into the leader's soul. Heals, warning him that the universe rarely offers second chances. You and I know this universal truth. Genuine redemption is never freely given. It is brutally earned by carrying the agonizing weight of the suffering we cause. She turns her back, Heals, her cane fading like a ticking clock. The gang leader finally shatters. Tears stream down his face as his toxic worldview disintegrates. He begs to know why they are showing him such impossible mercy. Lena looks at Mateo in the shadows, Heals, revealing that the terrifying crime boss protecting her today once had to walk this exact same path of fire to earn his soul back. Just as this realization settles, the diner door violently crashes open, and Marco steps back into the stark light. Heals. The camera lingers on the enforcer here, projecting a brutal shadow that forces a definitive choice. You and I are watching apex predators stripped of their teeth. A silent consensus ripples through the group. Heals, their toxic arrogance dissolving into submission. The leader lets his shoulders slump, confirming their defeat. Marco steps forward, his face like carved stone, to begin the extraction. Heals. It is a tragic display of dependency when the broken man whispers a trembling thank you to the architect of his ruin. Lena remains still in the dim light, offering zero validation. The heavy steel doors slam shut. Heals, echoing like the final seal on a stone crypt. Only when the red taillights fade into the black night does Lena exhale. 21 days later, a digital notification shatters the quiet. Heals. The pale glow illuminates Lena's face as the text confirms their compliance. She shifts her gaze to Matteo, his brow furrowing in a microscopic question. She speaks softly, reporting their adherence to the harsh protocol. Heals. You can almost see the tension leaving his jaw, a fleeting shadow of relief passing over his features. Yet a darker question hangs in the heavy air. Is this true redemption? Heals. Or merely the performative act of terrified men trying to avoid punishment? Time will tear the truth from them. Marco's conditioning is designed as a relentless forge. To shatter their toxic brotherhood, these men have been isolated. Heals. Stripped of their psychological armor, and thrust strictly into the shattered homes of the people they once terrorized. It is a terrifying stage set for a profound human reckoning. Heals. Let us focus the camera on Derek, standing at the threshold of the Castellano home. The matriarch inside is hollowed out by chronic trauma, her husband murdered by a violent pack 3 years prior. 2 teenage boys wander this dark house, Heals, desperately needing the father stolen from them. Derek is supposedly there for basic labor, but the reality is a suffocating web of hostility. On the first morning, he stands on the porch at exactly 6 o'clock, projecting forced obedience. Heals. The heavy door opens. The matriarch does not greet him. Instead, her dead eyes slowly rake over his frame, a dehumanizing glare that strips him to the bone. With a voice like cracking ice, she tells him he is late, establishing absolute control. Heals. It teaches a bitter lesson. Unhealed grief is often weaponized against anyone who comes near. Heals. She dictates a brutal schedule without blinking. When Derek defends his punctuality, she cuts him down, creating a reality where mere competence is failure. She drops the metal keys into his palm. Heals, daring him to prove he is more than the monster he once was. The scene cuts to the claustrophobic interior of the car. The boys radiate suffocating hostility from the back seat. The silence is physically heavy, broken only by the engine's cold hum. Heals. At a red light, the tension snaps. The older boy leans forward, his voice a razor blade. He forces Derek to meet his eyes in the rearview mirror, tearing into the sick psychology of the men who butchered his father. With devastating clarity, Heals, the son dissects their sadistic motivation, exposing the tragic delusion that inflicting cruelty could ever substitute for possessing true, lasting power. Heals. The boy builds an impenetrable emotional wall, ordering Derek to simply drive and become an invisible ghost in their lives. Derek absorbs the blow with a defeated nod. But watch closely how the lighting shifts. By the 21st day, Heals, the camera captures a profound change. Derek is bathed in sweat, his hands blistered as he rebuilds a broken porch railing the dead father had neglected. He expects no praise, having purchased the wood with his own funds. Inside, Heals, the grieving widow watches him through the glass. She maintains her bitter silence, yet slowly pushes open the screen door. She leaves a glass of cold water and a plate of food on the steps. It is not forgiveness, not yet, Heals. But it is a microscopic crack in her armor, reminding us of a vital life lesson. True redemption always begins in the shadows, built upon quiet, unrewarded acts of sacrifice. Heals. Stick with me, this is where the psychological layers get truly interesting. Watch closely as Derek is tested by chaos. A forgotten item forces him to wait 40 agonizing minutes in the sweltering heat, a trial he endures without complaint. Heals. Upon his return, the younger brother offers a fragile smile of thanks, but the older boy waits like a stone sentinel, searching for the hidden knife in Derek's kindness. Trauma teaches us to view every good deed as a manipulative trap. Later, Heals. Derek stands paralyzed in the shadows by the window, listening to a bitter family dispute. Inside, the younger boy timidly defends Derek's work. Instantly, the older brother explodes, his voice cracking with raw grief. Heals. He weaponizes their dead father's memory, screaming that a few hours of manual labor can never atone for the senseless violence that destroyed their lives. Heals. The angry son hurls a devastating moral paradox. Why give a monster the precious time violently stolen from a victim? A suffocating silence follows. Then the mother speaks. Her voice is trembling. Heals. Anchored by her dead husband's belief in human redemption. It is a breathtaking lesson echoing through the dark. Our capacity to forgive is the only true key to our own psychological freedom. Outside, the impact on Derek is catastrophic. Heals. His knees buckle against the house as his sociopathic armor shatters completely. He buries his face in his hands and begins to violently weep, crushed by the sheer agony of true empathy. As we pull the camera away from his tears, Heals. You and I must turn to the next file. Ryan, a former predator, is now the security detail for a young woman entirely paralyzed by the lingering agoraphobia of a brutal past assault. Heals. Let us open this bleak file together. Frame the shot on Ryan, a man whose life was built on brutal aggression, now forced to become a shield for a broken passenger. During the first week, the car acts as a claustrophobic theater of pain. Heals. She cowers in the back seat, trembling in terror. The camera catches Ryan staring into the mirror, muttering apologies to the empty air. By the second week, her frail voice cuts the silence, asking why he was so cruel to that innocent waitress. Heals. His answer drops like a stone. He whispers that he thought she was nobody. He had erased her humanity to justify his violence. Now the monstrous reality of his past is clawing into his brain. He grips the steering wheel, knuckles bone white, Heals, suffocating under his own guilt. He begs her, his voice cracking in the dim light, to tell him how to fix the profound damage he has done. Her dead eyes meet his in the glass. You cannot. Heals. She tells Ryan his only option is to stop being the disease that breaks the world. The camera hard cuts to Kurt, sweating under the harsh fluorescent lights of a Bronx community center. This setting deeply mirrors the exact life his victim once led. Heals. He is scrubbing graffiti off brick walls, surrounded by troubled youth. Diana, a weathered social worker, watches him from the doorway with clinical precision. When she pushes him on his motives, Kurt crumbles, Heals, spilling the grotesque details of his violent past. Diana does not flinch. She lets the ugly truth hang heavily in the dusty air before delivering a shattering psychological blow. Sweeping her hand toward the children, she reveals a dark reality. Heals. Half of them run from fathers just as violent as his former self. The other half stare into an agonizing void where a loving protector should have been. Heals. Diana points a steady finger toward the echoing gymnasium, offering Kurt a terrifying path to salvation. To wash his soul clean, he must become the shield these broken children never had. Heals. Watch as the days bleed together and Kurt's neurological wiring begins to rebuild. We see him bathed in the glow of late-night desk lamps, tutoring kids, his thin frame bearing the crushing weight of their tragedies. Heals. The forced empathy is violently tearing his old ego apart. The scene cuts back to the dimly lit diner. Lena sits across from Mateo, questioning if this psychological experiment is actually working. But Mateo, staring out at the dark street, Heals, understands the cruel timeline of the human soul. Even if these men eventually relapse into violence, the desperate attempt to heal them is a necessary intervention. It highlights a painful life lesson. Most people never even try to change. Heals. 6 weeks later, the sharp chime of the diner door slices the air like a blade. Lena looks up from the counter, her blood turning to ice. It is Derek. The camera pushes in on his horrifying physical decay. He is a walking ghost. Heals, his face gaunt from weeks of agonizing guilt. His hands, once used to inflict terror, now shake with uncontrollable tremors. The air in the diner instantly vaporizes into panic. Jimmy scrambles for the telephone, eyes wide with fear. Mateo, Heals, a coiled spring of protection, is already out of his booth, muscles tense for a collision. But I want you to watch Lena closely here. In a masterful display of psychological dominance, she forces her racing heart to slow. Heals. She gently places her cloth on the counter, her voice ringing out smooth and calm, commanding the room to stand down. Against all odds, she has finally claimed absolute control over her own waking nightmare. Heals. Lena's voice slices through the heavy diner air, pulling the oxygen back into the room. Mateo stays rooted, watching the door. When Derek steps into the fluorescent glare, he doesn't look like the monster he used to be. Heals. He moves with the fragile hesitation of a beaten dog. He stammers out that Marco expressly forbade this meeting, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of guilt. Heals. You and I know how compelling the urge to look a victim in the eye can be. It's a dark gravity. Lena simply points to the vinyl booth. Derek practically crumples into the seat, his legs giving out. The camera frames them tight, heels. Across from his trembling frame, Lena sits entirely motionless. The arrogance is burned away. All that remains is a fractured mind, reminding us that the cruelty we inflict on others eventually breaks us too, heels. He speaks with a fragile stiffness, a jarring contrast to the predatory swagger he used to wear like armor. His voice shakes as he begs permission to use her first name. Lena allows it, laying down a cold, neutral baseline. Across the table, heels. Derek's hands furiously rub the cheap formica surface, trying to soothe his racing nerves. Approaching her breaks Marco's rigid laws, a gamble that could cost him everything. But the rod inside him demands a confession, heels. Lena deploys a devastating tactic. Utter, punishing silence. It is a brilliant psychological maneuver. When you give a guilty conscience nothing but an empty vacuum, it forces the soul to dig up its own buried poison, heels. His eyes fill as he chokes out the grim reality of his punishment. The daily penance of scrubbing a dead man's floors and driving the victim's children to school, heels. He weeps while detailing the widow's crushing campaign of psychological warfare. You and I know the deepest cuts never require a raised voice. She simply placed photographs of her murdered husband next to Derek's coffee. No shouting, heels. Just quiet snapshots of weddings and sleepy infants. In those moments, his mental armor shattered. Every picture acted as a targeted strike against his denial, forcing him to see the raw human cost of his violence. The tears streamed down his face, heels, dissolving his pride. The final blow came when the teenage son walked in crying, beaten by other boys simply for lacking a father to protect him. It teaches us a brutal truth. Heels, the tragic ripples of our worst actions always outlive the momentary thrill of the act itself. Heels. Derek's breath hitches into ragged gasps as he recalls the older boy's blinding rage. In the quiet isolation of the diner, he finally reaches a terrifying climax of self-awareness. He sees himself not as a strong man, heels, but as a disease infecting the community. He admits his twisted worldview, the pathetic illusion that cruelty equals power, directly manufactured the grief inside that home. As she watches him fall apart, Lena feels a flicker of empathy, feels, but keeps her clinical mask perfectly in place. Derek admits his terror of the future, paralyzed by the fear that no amount of good behavior can wash away his dark nature. Lena leans in, probing for the true motive behind this dangerous visit, feels. Desperation floods his voice. He desperately needs her to know his violence was a reflection of his own brokenness. We learn here that healing begins only when we stop blaming others, feels. He systematically separates the victim from his deeply flawed psychology. Her quiet professional kindness acted as a mirror, exposing the hollow void inside his chest. Pressing the heels of his hands into his burning eyes, heels, he confesses the ugly reality of his ego. Her simple human decency made him feel incredibly small. To protect his fragile self-image, he tried to psychologically destroy her. The diner falls into a heavy silence, broken only by his sharp breaths. Heels. He explains that the widow's daily hospitality triggers that exact same feeling of smallness now. But the lens is different. He no longer sees kindness as a threat, but as an unearned grace that exposes his own moral failure, heels. It reminds us that true strength requires accepting grace when we least deserve it. He finally admits, with tragic vulnerability, that he has no right to demand her absolution, heels. He fully understands he has no claim to her forgiveness. Yet, his mental recovery demands he speak his remorse to the woman he broke. He stresses this apology is his own choice. No forced labor pushed him into this booth, heels. He has finally grown the capacity to feel the safety he once stole. Lena absorbs his confession. Let's look at this closely, shall we? It is a deeply human urge to offer immediate forgiveness just to make someone stop crying, heels. But Lena knows a sharper truth. Handing out cheap grace ruins the hard work of actual change. Instead of offering a warm platitude, she launches a surgical inquiry. She demands he identify the true center of her trauma, heels. When he stares in blank ignorance, she plainly tells him it was never about the public humiliation. Sometimes, holding our boundaries is the most compassionate thing we can do, heels. She bypasses the noisy layer of physical terror. Locking eyes with him, she names the invisible venom of her nightmare, the creeping anxiety that he had permanently ruined her right to exist safely in the world, heels. Derek's posture collapses under the gravity of his guilt, But here, Lena executes a masterful shift in the narrative. She defines true psychological safety not as a condition dictated by monsters, but as an impenetrable internal fortress. Feels. She actively chose to strip his assault of its lasting power. He weakly pushes back, whispering that her mercy is far greater than he deserves. She cuts him off with cold precision. Heals. Her healing has absolutely nothing to do with validating his redemption arc. It is simply the act of evicting him from her mind. The ultimate lesson here is that our peace is never owned by those who manage to hurt us. Feels. She cleanly severs her recovery from his desperate need to be a good person again. His acts of service matter, but she names their actual function. They are just tools to construct a new identity, one that doesn't rely on sadism. Feels. He absorbs this clinical breakdown, quietly wiping his face. Then Lena draws her absolute boundary. She acknowledges the truth of his apology and sees the authentic pain in his eyes. But she decisively locks away the prize he came for. Feels. Her external forgiveness. True absolution, she insists, is a brutal metric he has to earn in the quiet of his own soul. Derek accepts the weight of this boundary, standing up slowly. As he heads for the door, she offers one last, hard truth. Feels. Looking your victim in the eye takes massive endurance. The lesson? Don't waste the profound pain of waking up to your own darkness. Feels. The second the door swings shut, the crushing pressure in the diner evaporates. Mateo instantly moves back into the space, taking the exact seat the predator just left to anchor Lena to reality. The adrenaline crash breaks her emotional dam. Feels. And hot tears finally spill over her cheeks. Yet, underneath the physical shaking, she recognizes her own unshakable stability. Mateo takes her trembling hand, grounding her with a crucial truth. Feels. By refusing to give Derek the cheap drug of immediate forgiveness, Lena forced him to consume the only medicine that creates real change, absolute truth. Outside in the cold, Derek stands under a buzzing street lamp. Feels. In a stunning display of accountability, he types a text to his boss. He confesses his forbidden visit, burning down his old habits of lies. Growth only happens when we finally stop hiding in the shadows. Feels. Derek sends off his formal surrender, fully accepting whatever punishment Marco will deliver. The phone vibrates in his hand almost immediately. The widow had already stepped into the chain of command, demanding that Derek remain in his position. Feels. She sees that the wall of his ego has finally crumbled to dust. He is truly starting to feel the suffocating weight of the damage he caused. Standing alone in the bleak twilight, Derek registers an entirely alien emotion, a fragile spark of real hope. Feels. Completely disconnected from his old arrogance. And this brings us to the end of the timeline, you and I. Hours later, the diner is locked down and scrubbed clean. The sharp smell of bleach fills the air. Mateo and Lena sit silently at the counter. Feels. They are quiet sentinels reflecting on a simple truth. Genuine human redemption is built slowly in the dark. Feels. Let us observe our subjects one last time in their midnight sanctuary, painted in neon and shadows. The ritual of pouring coffee acts as a necessary anchor, bringing their racing nervous systems back to a steady rhythm. Feels. Mateo watches Lena's heavy silence with the sharp eyes of a man who knows violence intimately. She is fighting a war of cognitive dissonance, doubting her own mercy. She offered her tormentor a choice, a literal test of free will. Feels. But the dread of failure gnaws at her. What if Derek was just saying what I wanted to hear? She whispers into her mug. Mateo's voice cuts through the doubt like a cold blade. He reminds her that Derek's acting skills no longer matter. Feels. Because he has to face the actual fire of consequence. The final lesson is clear. True change is proven by heavy actions, not empty apologies. Feels. But what if someone else gets hurt while we wait to find out? Lena asks, her quiet composure finally fracturing. You and I must look closely here, because her question reveals the suffocating weight of survivor guilt. Feels. She fears her mercy was just a polite mask for weakness. Mateo refuses to let her drown. He closes the distance, his solita presence anchoring her spiraling mind. You are not soft, he tells her, tearing down her doubt brick by brick. Feels. He reminds her that offering violent men a chance at redemption requires staggering emotional armor. He admits his own methods would have simply broken those men down to nothing, leaving them paralyzed. It brings us to a harsh but vital lesson. Feels. True strength is never about having the capacity to destroy. It is the quiet, exhausting discipline of offering grace when you hold the power to ruin. Feels. The lighting paints bruised shadows across his face as he speaks with chilling clarity. He admits his first instinct was to shatter those men with pure terror. It is dangerously easy for blind rage to disguise itself as righteous protection. Feels. But Lena tells him that giving in to sadism would only poison the man he is trying to be. Her voice trembles. When they tore her uniform, they stripped away her invisible armor. Feels. Seeing Mateo burst through that door brought an overwhelming wave of safety, yet it sliced open a new wound. It forced her back into a box she despises, the helpless victim waiting for a hero. Sometimes, feels, the deepest pain does not come from the trauma itself. It comes from the sudden loss of our own independence, a bitter grief that requires immense courage to overcome. Feels. The camera pushes in on Mateo. His jaw tightens. He leans forward, absolutely refusing to let her drown in this quiet shame. You never needed a savior, he insists, his voice a grounding rumble in the room. Feels. He draws a strict line between being helpless and simply allowing someone to hold a shield. But her internal crisis runs deep. For 3 grueling years, she built this life, molding herself into a person defined by grace. And in 30 seconds, feels. 3 broken men smashed it to pieces. She whispers her darkest fear, that her gentle nature is just a polite disguise for weakness. Mateo stops her cold. He forces her to look him in the eye, delivering a truth we all need to hear. Feels. Another person's violent cruelty is never a reflection of your empathy. It is only ever a reflection of their own hollow soul. Feels. He refuses to break eye contact, dissecting the attackers with cold precision. They chose cruelty strictly because they are empty inside. When Lena tries to argue, he gently speaks over her. Feels. He paints a picture of exactly what he saw when he kicked that door open. He did not find a shattered victim. He found a woman mastering her terror by gripping onto a single truth, that he would arrive at his usual time. Lena exhales, nodding slowly. Feels. She used his routine as a psychological lifeline. Mateo frames this beautifully, offering a profound lesson. Leaning on someone you love is never an act of submission. It is an earth-shattering level of trust. Feels. To stare pure evil in the face and hold out for rescue requires a quiet bravery that raw violence simply cannot comprehend. Feels. Lena collapses against his chest, letting his steady breath ground her racing nerves. Her thoughts remain dark. She pictures a local widow, completely broken by the same kind of ruthless men. Survivor guilt is crushing her. Feels. How can she offer forgiveness when others are left to drown in grief? Here we can uncover a profound truth about healing. Mateo flips her worldview entirely. Feels. He explains that this aching awareness of pain is exactly what earns her the right to be merciful. She knows how deep trauma cuts, meaning she truly understands the miracle of a second chance. He holds up his scarred hands, feels, pointing to the violent enforcer he used to be. True grace is never blind optimism. It is the radical, difficult choice to plant a seed of hope in a world you know is entirely capable of burning. Feels. The camera stays tight on her trembling hands. She had refused to let the criminal world swallow him, believing a lost soul could be saved. Mateo knows this is the absolute truth. She did not just pull him from the wreckage. Feels. She carefully dismantled the ruthless enforcer he was, watering the dry earth to grow a real man in his place. This memory shatters her final defenses. She breaks down. Feels. Confessing the severe depression that almost ate her alive during the months he was missing. She wanted the relentless pain to stop. But when he finally stumbled back through her door, bleeding and weighed down by his sins, she learned a vital lesson. Feels. Watching the person you love become entirely consumed by their own hateful rage is a fate infinitely more destructive than simply mourning at their grave. Feels. Just peace, he murmurs in a rough whisper. He beautifully captures the brutal paradox of the life they are trying to build. Violence is seductively easy. War hands you simple rules. You are either the predator or the prey. Feels. But peace is a grueling daily discipline. It forces you to stand in the gray areas, to strip away your armor, and do the exhausting work of forgiving yourself. He does not sugarcoat his internal war. Feels. He has fought for years to stop answering fear with a closed fist. When he saw those men hurting her, his instinct screamed to become the monster again. He only held back because of Lena. We must realize that true love acts as a heavy anchor. Feels. It holds you to a higher standard, dragging you back into the light, even when your blood burns for absolute vengeance. Feels. They sit perfectly still in the dim diner, 2 bruised souls synchronizing their breathing after the storm. Lena studies his face, asking a heavy question. Does he ever miss the intoxicating high of being feared? His answer strips away all pretense. Feels. He admits he sometimes misses the brutal simplicity of a world where you answer to no one. But he forcefully rejects the horrific tax that power demands. the slow rotting of the soul, and the endless paranoia of a knife in the back. Feels. He looks around at the worn booths and humming coffee machines. This ordinary room is not a cage. It is a hard-earned sanctuary. The lesson here is vital. Real peace is often discovered in the most mundane, quiet places. Feels. Because only there can genuine emotional strength finally take root and grow. Feels. Real power, he tells her softly, is never about breaking another person to feel tall. It is the endurance of holding onto your gentle heart when the world tries to rip it away. This is a staggering shift for a man who once ruled through violent ego. Feels. Hearing this, Lena finally stops fighting herself. She sinks into his embrace, her nerves sinking to the drum of his heartbeat. I love you, she whispers. 3 words forged in the fires of hell. He grips her tighter, feels, cursing himself for being seconds too late. But you and I need to look closely at her face. The fragile fear is gone. She stops his apologies, embracing a profound lesson. Those seconds of terror were not a punishment, feels. They were the exact fire her spirit needed to harden from soft clay into unbreakable steel. Feels. She grasps the truth. Her soft heart was never a flaw. It is her thickest armor. Matteo looks at her with reverence, calling her the strongest person he knows. Through the window, headlights blur past. The world rushes forward, feels, blind to the miracle in this booth. Here are 2 people who took a knife to their darkest instincts and chose grace. For the first time since the attack, Lena takes a deep breath, the fractured pieces of her soul clicking back into place. Feels. 3 months slip by. The oppressive heat breaks into a crisp autumn, cooling the fever of their trauma. The diner settles back into its comforting rhythm of pouring coffee and wiping counters. It teaches us a beautiful truth. Simple daily routines, feels, when finally rooted in safety, become the steady heartbeat of true healing. Feels. Watch how she moves now. Lena still glides between tables with familiar warmth, but the air around her has fundamentally changed. The locals feel it immediately. Her smile remains genuine, but the naive fragility is gone. Feels. She does not just serve this room, she commands it. Her new posture radiates a vital lesson. True kindness is a chosen gift, never a weakness for others to exploit. No one will ever mistake her gentleness for an invitation to hurt her again. Suddenly, feels, the sharp ring of the front bell cuts the chatter. Every head snaps up, shoulders instantly going tight, as the ghost of that violent night sweeps through the diner. But the camera pans to show it is just old Mr. Patterson, feels, slowly shaking off his autumn coat. A collective heavy breath is released into the morning air. Feels. Mr. Patterson orders his usual, the exchange acting like a warm blanket over the room's nerves. Tucked in the shadows of the corner booth, Matteo sits rigid. He claims this seat daily. From this angle, his dark eyes never stop tracking the door, feels, mapping every step Lena takes. We must recognize the reality of his trauma. You can dress a wolf in civilian clothes, but rewriting its instincts takes a lifetime. His brain is wired for war, always hunting for threats, yet feels. When Lena catches his stare, she never feels smothered. She smiles, finding deep comfort in his protection. It teaches us that true love means embracing the broken parts of your partner, feels. The tension finally snaps when Maria yells an order from the kitchen, forcing the ordinary world to simply keep spinning. Feels. Behind the counter, Maria is fighting a completely silent psychological war. She is transformed into a fierce guard dog, her eyes burning into every man who enters, waiting for a wrong move. Lena tries to offer a lifeline, feels, promising the danger has passed, but Maria responds with a fiery defense that reveals a beautiful truth. You and I can take a vital life lesson from this, feels. Putting up thick emotional boundaries to protect your heart does not mean you have to stand behind those walls alone. The diner hums along until the silver doorbell rings again. Suddenly, the air turns to absolute ice, feels. The clinking of coffee cups stops entirely. Every breath catches. Derek, Ryan, and Kurt step slowly over the threshold, walking right back into the sanctuary they had recently tried to destroy. Feels. In extreme tension, body language reveals who truly controls the room. Jimmy freezes at the grill. Matteo lowers his newspaper with an agonizing, dangerous slowness. Mr. Patterson leaves his fork suspended in the air. But Lena does not flinch, feels. She steps right up to the men, her spine perfectly straight. The heavy silence stretches until it threatens to snap. Finally, Derek speaks. He is no longer barking violent orders. Instead, feels. He quietly begs for permission to sit down as a simple customer. The arrogant swagger of a predator is gone, replaced by a hollow submission. Beside him, Ryan stares at the floor, carrying the sorrowful weight of his own monstrous reflection. Feels. The lesson here is incredibly simple. True strength is never a loud display of force. It is the quiet, unwavering refusal to be moved. Feels. The camera pushes in slowly on Kurt. Here is a man built entirely for violence, shrinking into his shoulders like a dog waiting for a strike. The harsh fluorescent lights catch the tears spilling from Ryan's eyes, Feels, revealing a devastating emotional rupture. His voice cracks as he confesses that the woman he helped did not leave him on the cold porch. She brought him inside to sit at her family table. Beside him, Kurt nods slowly. He whispers about Marcus, Feels, a mute child at the community center who simply wanted him to attend a basketball game. For these deeply broken men, it is the terrifying, beautiful dawn of genuine human attachment. The simple truth we can all take away is this, Feels. Every single one of us just wants to truly belong to someone, even if we are feeling that kind of safety for the very first time. Feels. If you look at Derek's trembling hands, you witness the crushing weight of a guilty conscience. His breath catches sharply as he speaks of Marco Jr. The boy had looked up at him, sharing fragile memories of his dead father, Feels, unknowingly projecting his hollow loss onto Derek. The child truly believed his father would be proud of the men fixing their porch. Across the counter, Lena maintains a mask of cold stone, but the faint glimmer in her eyes betrays a quiet empathy, Feels. Suddenly, the harsh scrape of Mateo's chair cuts through the tension like a sharp warning. Lena leans in, delivering a heavy life lesson we must all remember. Real, lasting change is never about the grand gestures we perform when people are watching, Feels. It is about the difficult choices we make when we are alone in the dark, Feels. Derek turns his bruised gaze toward the men beside him, before looking back at Lena. His voice is barely a hoarse whisper as he admits her mercy dragged them back from the edge of their own destruction. The quiet hum of the diner stops, Feels. Every patron is watching this raw public surrender. Lena takes a long breath, letting the silence settle before she rebuilds the rules of their world. She draws an absolute line in the sand. If they return to her sanctuary, Feels, they will pay for their coffee, they will treat every soul with unwavering respect, and they will swallow their violent anger. One slip back into their old bloody habits, and the door closes forever. The lesson here is profound, Feels. Setting firm boundaries is the only true way we can ever learn how to love properly, Feels. Not a tremor of doubt enters Lena's voice. She commands the room with the quiet, terrifying gravity of a judge passing sentence, and the three hardened men nod in absolute submission. Lena knows how easily a wounded ego wraps itself in false nobility, Feels. She locks onto their eyes, shattering any illusion that they are the heroes in this story. They are not getting a medal, and her forgiveness cannot be bought. They are allowed inside only because her doors are open to the broken. Derek swallows hard, Feels, his voice thick with raw gratitude as he thanks her. She coldly nods toward a dim corner booth, offering a safe harbor away from the staring crowd. The lesson here is profound. Sometimes, Feels, the absolute greatest grace we can ever offer a ruined person is simply a quiet place to sit down and rest, Feels. Before the men sink into the seats, the dynamic shifts completely. The frail woman from booth 3, the living embodiment of collateral damage from their past violence, shuffles toward their table. She holds them in a gaze weighed down by trauma, Feels, yet she is entirely fearless. She speaks of her grandson, a student dedicating his life to healing men drowning in explosive rage. She demands that they do not give up, Feels, pleading that this world desperately needs proof that monsters can learn to become men again. She leaves them completely paralyzed by the unbearable weight of pure hope. By the register, Mateo quietly questions if Lena knows what she is doing, Feels. She does not, but she firmly holds the line. The lesson here is important. Believing in the redemption of a broken soul is a massive gamble, but it is one that is always worth taking, Feels. The gentle clatter of coffee cups returns, and the diner settles back into its normal heartbeat. Deep in their corner, the three men barely speak. When they push through the exit doors, they leave behind 3 thick bills on the table, Feels. It is a desperately silent apology wrapped in a massive tip. Watching from the counter, Jimmy wonders aloud if this fragile piece will hold. Lena does not look away from the empty booth, her voice steeped in clinical detachment. She gave them the map, Feels, but they must walk that hard road themselves. Mr. Patterson praises her deep compassion, but she shakes her head, refusing the crown of a savior. The beautiful life lesson here is simple. No matter how deep the scars of our past may run, Feels, a human soul always retains the quiet power to choose to heal, Feels. In the corner booth, Mateo sits perfectly still, his newspaper nothing more than a prop. His dark eyes trace Lena's every move. He is watching a master orchestrate her territory, holding back the violence of the world not with a closed fist, feels, but with a terrifying blend of grace and ironclad rules. Out on Route 9, sirens wail and the chaotic machinery of the city grinds on. Inside these glass walls, a fragile miracle is taking root. This is not the hollow quiet of defeated men, feels. It is the agonizing effort of predators consciously choosing to keep their teeth hidden. Matteo and Lena share a silent look across the room. This gives us a beautiful life lesson. True safety is never handed to us by the outside world, feels. It is a shelter we must actively build together, feels. Stick with me, because you and I are going to unpack this final frame together. These people built a sanctuary right in the middle of a war zone. The violent threats outside will never stop, but by standing shoulder to shoulder, feels, they created an unbreakable fortress of the mind. This diner is breathing proof that the darkest parts of human nature can be rewritten. It proves that holding someone accountable and showing them deep mercy can be the exact same thing, feels. Two hardened survivors, deeply familiar with the mechanics of violence, chose to engineer peace instead. This brings us to the ultimate life lesson of this bitter road. True lasting power is never found in the raw ability to break things apart, feels. It is found in the quiet strength it takes to hold the broken pieces together.